morning, wherever you are. Thank you for rejoining us at this webinar organised by Prosvishenia and Express Publishing. For those of you who didn't see the first seminar, my name is Дэниел Моррис. I'm an Express Publishing academic consultant, and today in our second webinar I'm going to be talking to you about primary learning. I hope that many of you joining us today, if you are primary teachers, I hope this presentation will be useful for you. When designing this webinar and when thinking about how to present some new materials to you, I was thinking that often, we have a lot of different presentations on primary learning. So why not make it a bit more interactive and a bit more engaging for you, the teachers? So today's webinar, this second webinar, will be more like a quiz, kind of interactive quiz. I've prepared different questions on primary learning. So if you wish, you can participate from wherever you are, answer the questions together, and we'll go through the answers together. The main aim of this talk is to address primary learning issues that we have as teachers. So some of the main things that we need to consider as primary teachers, and also we'll be looking at specifically many of the methodologies that are used when teaching primary learners and why they are important and why they are necessary for us as teachers to help us develop our primary learners' English skills from even from the lowest levels. So let's begin. So quite often in our primary classes we have a beginning the lesson section. Normally we can find this in our teachers' books. We always have maybe some suggestions on how to begin the primary lesson. Now normally in most primary lessons, beginning the lesson would involve perhaps checking the homework. Now, having checked the homework, how do we begin the lesson? We have three options here. So first of all, because we need to do something at the beginning of the lesson. Option B, because we need to revise key patterns from the previous lessons. Or option C, because we need to wait for the students who are late to come. So if you're thinking about this where you are, we have some different options here. I think hopefully most of you by now would have chosen option B as the correct answer. It's always important to revise key patterns with our students at the beginning of the lesson. As you are, I'm sure you're aware, with primary students, it's always important to recap and revise different language, different grammar structures with our students as often as possible, as quite often our students don't have perhaps the memory skills to be able to remember everything they've been taught. They need to be able to practice and revise constantly to keep the language and the different structures fresh in their minds. And by doing this as teachers, we're also able to see how students have progressed, if they've been able to successfully acquire the language we've been teaching in the class, or if they need a little bit more help and support. Of course, it's always good to do something at the beginning of the lesson, but as option A suggests, but the main aim for us as teachers is to be revising these different key patterns. So we can see here, this is taken from a teacher's book, from one of our Express Publishing titles. The teacher's book always suggests different activities to revise language. So here we have asking pupils to tell you 2 things they can do and 2 things they cannot do. So in the previous lesson, we would have studied can and can't, and in the next lesson, having gone over the homework, perhaps we can then have the students perhaps create some sentences or explain to the class what they can and can't do. So in this way, they're revising and recapping what we've studied in the previous class. Okay, so question 2. In the same way that we have beginning the lesson sections, why do we have ending the lesson sections? We have 3 options here. The first option, because we need to finish the lesson on a high note recapping key ideas. B, because there are always 5 minutes left and nothing to do. Hopefully in most classes this wouldn't be our normal situation. Hopefully we would, as teachers, we would have planned our lesson so that we don't have our students sitting around doing nothing at the end of the class. And C, because it's in the book, so we have to do it. So, okay, maybe it is in the book, doesn't necessarily mean we have to do it, but we always need to take into account the different methodologies that are expressed in the teacher's books. So the answer, of course, would be A. In the same way that we need to recap language at the beginning of a lesson, we should also always revise and recap language at the end of the lesson. Again, this helps us as teachers see the progress of our students throughout the class, enables the students to demonstrate to us, the teachers, what they've learned. And normally when we end the lesson in this way, we can perhaps focus on different games or different activities so that the lesson ends on a high note. We want our students to leave the class with a smile on their face, having hopefully learned the language we wanted them to learn in a fun and engaging way. So here we have an example of how to end the lesson. So here we have an activity to consolidate language at the end of the lesson. Ask pupils to close their eyes. Ask a student or pupil to describe one of his or her classmates. Then they open their eyes and check the pupil's description. Repeat with as many pupils as you think is necessary. So in this lesson, we would assume that we've been teaching different adjectives for describing people. So we can end the lesson with a fun game where students describe their classmates and perhaps the other students have to guess which classmates they are. We're revising vocabulary, but in the same way it's fun and engaging, and students will be able to leave the classroom with a smile on their face. Okay, our third question. Why do we have pictures in our books? So in many primary books, as I'm sure you've seen, we always have lots of bright colors, decorations, lots of different animations, cartoons, some realistic pictures as well. Why do we have so many pictures in our books? Is it because they're beautiful? Is it because we want our books to always be something nice to look at? Is it because they're useful for visual learners and they help us to present vocabulary through word-picture association? Or is it because we need to fill up white space in the book? Is it because we just need to fill up our books? So hopefully many of you will have picked answer B. Of course, we use lots of different pictures in our books to help our visual learners and help us present vocabulary through picture-word association. I'm sure you're all very aware of differentiated learning styles. We have different learners have different learning styles. For example, we have visual learners, they learn by seeing, auditory learners, they learn by hearing, or kinesthetic learners learn by doing. At primary levels, it's always important to have this visual element here, as vision is something that, according to a recent study that I actually came across while preparing this talk, of our 5 senses, vision actually traps all other senses. It's our strongest sense. And in this way, by presenting vocabulary through vision, through pictures, we allow the students to make the necessary connections between the words and what it means to them. So that's why we have lots of different vocabulary presented in different ways, either with animated cartoon pictures or with real life pictures. In both cases, the students are making connections between the new vocabulary and the examples given to them in a visual context. Okay, next question. Why do we have such small tasks? I'm sure in many of the course books that we use at primary levels, I'm sure you've seen before that we have in a lesson we'll have many different tasks. One lesson can have maybe 7 or 8 different tasks that are normally quite small. Why do we have such small tasks for our primary learners? Is it because they're easier to write? Is it because the attention span of the students is short and they need some variety? Or is it because simply they're easier to teach for us and it makes our jobs a bit easier? While hopefully, we would hope that perhaps C might help us, the answer in fact of course is B. because of our attention spans. Our primary learners, many of our primary learners, they're still developing many of their cognitive skills. And as I'm sure you're aware, as primary teachers, many of our students often get bored very quickly. It's very important to have different tasks that engage our students in different ways. Our students need variety. They don't want to be spending 10 minutes on one task. If they spend more than 5 or 6 minutes on a task, quite often they'll get bored, and when students get bored, this can quite often lead to non-participation and chaos in the classroom. So we need some different activities that engage and motivate our learners in different ways and keep them interested in the lesson context. So we can see here some different examples. We always have some short exercises, so circling the correct grammar, some reading and writing activities kept very short, very simple. The students are practicing the target language, the target structures, but in a simple, concise way, so that we can practice and then move on to the next activity and keep them engaged, while also helping them to use the language in the correct and appropriate ways. Next point. Why are the grammar boxes so small in our primary books? Again, as I'm sure you're aware, as I'm sure you've seen, many of the primary books for our younger learners, there's not so much focus on grammar. So why is this? Perhaps because there is not enough room to squeeze everything on the page. So perhaps we have too many pictures on our page and not enough room for grammar. Maybe perhaps because the students are too young to understand the grammar. Or perhaps because we need to present as much grammar as the cognitive awareness of the students will allow for them to be able to understand it effectively. So if we have a look at the options, A, perhaps no. B, this can be true in some cases. Many primary students perhaps don't understand much of the grammar rules. If for example, we explain to our students the present continuous, and we explain that the present continuous is used for actions happening now or for future arrangements, our primary students will not understand this kind of concept. We need to be able to explain the grammar in a way that they will actually be able to understand. So this is why our answer will be more C, because we need to present the grammar in a way that matches the cognitive level of the students. At primary levels, many of our primary learners will still be developing their cognitive skills, and it's in this way that we need to present grammar in a way that will be familiar to them. We won't focus heavily on grammar structures or the meaning of grammar, what it actually means and the grammar rules, but more just how to acquire the language, how to acquire the grammar through careful practice and through activation of the grammar. So as we can see here, we have a small grammar section going over some of the general structures, and then some short, simple exercises to practice using the grammar without explaining it too much. The students will be able to understand here that can is something that they will be able to do, while can't is something that they're unable to do. Using the smiley faces and the frowning faces in the exercise, it's kept at a level where the students can understand how the grammar is being used without going into too much detail. At primary levels, we always want our students to be able to first acquire the language, acquire the grammar, before they can actually understand what it's used for. So our next question, why do we need to have speaking tasks after grammar presentation? So we've presented our grammar, we've practiced a little bit in the previous slides. Why do we need to have a speaking task with our grammar always? So A, because we need to put the phenomena on a realistic basis for students to understand where to apply this knowledge. B, we don't need them, they're a waste of time and we can skip them if there is no time. Or C, we may need them but I don't really know how to handle them, so I'm replacing them with gap fill exercises on the board. Now, many of us have probably used answer C before, use gap fill activities on the board. They can be an effective way to practice grammar, but do they actually allow our students to use the grammar? Whenever we teach English, whenever we teach vocabulary, whenever we teach grammar or skills, our overall objective always as teachers is for our students to be able to use the English effectively. So that's why the answer would be A. We need to put the grammar phenomena on a realistic basis. We need the students to understand, first of all, why the grammar is there, why it's being used, and also understand where to apply the grammar rules effectively, and also to be able to actually use the grammar in a realistic context. So at primary levels, we can normally achieve this by introducing a communicative activity or some kind of game to activate the grammar. Here we can see an ask and answer activity. Can Lily climb? No, she can't. So we have two students interacting using the target grammar, and in this way they're speaking and practicing the grammar in a real life context through communicative activities. And on exercise 5 we have a game. A game can be a great way to activate grammar. As we can see here, we've got a find someone who can activity. So students can, in the class, they can ask each other, can you sing, can you draw, can you play the guitar? And they can, normally they could fill out perhaps like a short survey or something like that. This is something I've done before in my classes. Or they can just feed back to the rest of the class based on what their classmates can and can't do. The overall objective with the game, of course, is for it to be fun, for it to have the students being engaged and motivated, but the overall objective, of course, the students are practicing the grammar structures can and can't in a realistic and in a meaningful context. Next question. Why do we present the new vocabulary before the dialogue? So in many of our express publishing books, we have dialogues, we have stories that follow the main lesson. But before this, we always introduce our vocabulary first. Why is this exactly? Is it because at these levels we need to establish some vocabulary to understand, to enable understanding? Is it because the vocabulary is more important than the dialogue? Or is it because the book is designed this way, so I must follow it? Now again, as we talked about before with the grammar, it's always important to establish some kind of understanding. That's why the answer would be A. Because these levels, we need to introduce vocabulary to our students before we focus on a dialogue, as much of the vocabulary is often repeated throughout the dialogue. So by giving the students the vocabulary first, we give them this understanding, this familiarity with the vocabulary that they are then exposed to in a more realistic context through the dialogue. We can see here, this is a lesson taken from Smiles. At the very top of the page, we can see our target vocabulary is introduced first. So we have here the different parts of the body: head, hair, eyes, nose, mouth, and so on. And then some of the same vocabulary is recycled and repeated through the dialogue. So by introducing the vocabulary first, we establish this understanding, and then students can follow the dialogue with a greater level of understanding of the vocabulary and can see it used in context in a story that can, motivate and engage them. Okay, next question. Why do we watch a video before we study a dialogue? So many of in fact all of our primary books where we have dialogues, as we saw in the previous slide, always have a video that will accompany the dialogue, and always have an animated video that brings the dialogue to life. Why do we do this? We have some more options here. So maybe it's because there's not enough time to do the video after the dialogue. In our classes, we're always running out of time, so perhaps there's not enough time. Because it's a pity not to watch it. We have such amazing videos. Of course, yes, it's always a shame to not watch the videos. But I think the answer we're all looking for is C, because it helps students understand what happens in the dialogue in a lively way without the use of L1. Whenever we have a dialogue, it's always good for students to watch the video first, as it can help them to understand what is actually happening in the dialogue through the animated sequences of the dialogue. And also, this is done in a way where we, the teachers, don't have to necessarily explain the dialogue using our L1 language. The students, by watching the video, can gain a general understanding of what's going to happen throughout the dialogue. So they're exposed to the language without using their L1. They can quite easily follow the video that will provide some English exposure, and they'll be able to see what's going to happen in the rest of the dialogue. So that's why we always use our videos first. Always a good tool to use in the classroom, and it can, of course, it's very engaging, very motivating for students, and they love watching videos at these levels, so why not use them to our advantage? The next question, why do we do the comprehension questions before we analyze the dialogue? So whenever we have a dialogue, we always have, after our dialogue, we have some comprehension questions that can follow it. Why do we do this? Why do we not analyze the dialogue first? Why don't we look at the key vocabulary and break everything down, then do the comprehension questions? So let's have a look at some of the options. We don't. A, we don't. We must fully analyze and translate the dialogue before we do them. Now, this is something that a lot of teachers often tend to do. They always translate dialogues for their students in their L1. This can be, as we know, it's not a very effective tool, as I'm sure we're all aware that it's not always possible to directly translate from English into our L1 language. And if we do this, we run the risk of giving our students some bad habits when it comes to translating directly. Can affect them later on when they're studying, and it's not a very recommended tool to use. And of course, we're always trying to use English as much as we can in the classroom. We don't want to be translating every single word. B, we may or may not do this. It depends on how I feel on the day. So this may be okay. We've all had days where we feel like we don't want to do the activities, but this shouldn't really override our lesson objectives. So our answer we're looking for here would be C, of course. We do this because students should try to understand without assistance, thus practicing a real-life skill. If you imagine that in the future, many of our primary students will be doing exams. In an exam, will our students have the option to translate a text for them? Will they be able to use a dictionary in the test? Of course, they won't be able to do this. So by practicing these skills at a young level, by exposing students to the idea that we don't have to translate, we should try to first understand and try and understand as much as we can from context, we are exposing our young learners to essential skills that perhaps they can use in later life. In exams, no one's going to tell them the answer in later life, so this is a good skill for them to use. So this is why we should always do the comprehension questions first, allow the students to use their own knowledge, try and understand as much as they can from context, and this helps them build some essential skills. Next question, why don't we translate the dialogue? So we talked a little bit before in the previous question about some of the disadvantages of translation in dialogues, and we talked about actually, because we create wrong and unrealistic student habits. This can be something that can affect students quite a lot. Before I joined Express Publishing, I worked in Spain for several years as a teacher, and I came across a lot of students that would quite often try and translate directly from Spanish to English, and quite simply it didn't work. And whenever they came to writing or speaking activities, they'd get a lot of their phrases wrong or incorrect, and it'd be quite difficult to understand them at times. So we don't want to create these unrealistic student habits. Translation is a useful tool, of course, and it's something that can be studied at higher levels in universities, for example. But we should always, especially at primary levels, we should try to avoid translation as much as possible, and allow students to gain understanding from context and involve some different ways to present vocabulary without having to translate it. We talked earlier about visual presentation of vocabulary. This can be one way to avoid having to translate in the classroom. So this is why we don't really tend to translate dialogue so much. Our next question: why do students act out dialogues? So whenever we have a dialogue in our classroom, whenever we have an activity or a dialogue, quite often we will have a role play activity that follows it, or some kind of act out activity. Why do we have these in our classes? Is it because it's a funny activity and our students want to be actors? Is it because it's a good chance for me to rest my voice? I'm sure as teachers we've all been in this situation where we would like to stop talking for 5 minutes and just have a bit of a rest. Or is it because it improves intonation and pronunciation and reading skills? Now, whereas A and B could be half answers, perhaps half correct, our real answer would be C, of course. By acting out dialogues, our students can practice reading aloud, and by doing this they can improve their intonation and pronunciation and reading skills for the topic vocabulary, and it allows us as teachers to see how our students are able to express themselves in English. While our students act out these different dialogues, it's always a good opportunity for us to walk around our classrooms and monitor our students to see if they are able to pronounce the words correctly, and if they have any problems with different words that we can go back to later, and perhaps we can do some drilling activities to practice the correct pronunciation. So it's a good way for students to practice, and also a good way for us as teachers to monitor their progress and identify potential problems. Next question: why do we listen, watch, read and write sometimes within the same task? So quite often in primary levels we'll see a lot of different tasks that involve many different skills within one task. So we'll have, as it says in the question, we'll have listening, reading, writing within the same exercise. Why do we have these different approaches within one exercise? Well, if we look at some of the answers, because of differentiated instruction, because we don't want to feel bored, because the book was designed that way. So we have some different answers. Some are a bit off the mark, some are a bit closer. Answer B, if we look at answer B, we don't want the students to feel bored. This can be a half answer. As we mentioned before, we always want to keep some variety in our primary classroom. We always want our students to be motivated and engaged. So by giving them different exercises, by giving them different tasks, we keep them motivated and we keep them, using different skills. But this isn't the main reason. Our main reason would be, of course, because of differentiated instruction. As I mentioned before in the previous slides, of course, as teachers, in your classrooms, you know your students better than anyone, and you know your students who learn best by reading, or you know your students who learn best by seeing or doing or listening. So it's important to implement differentiated instruction in primary level classes, as our primary students will have different motivations. They'll have different preferred ways of learning, so it's important to incorporate all of these different methods within the same exercise so that students practice and reproduce language in many different ways. So we can see here some examples of differentiated instruction. Here we're talking about my family, so here we have a reading, a listening and checking activity. So we have visual representation, we have the audio element here as well. So students are practicing different skills. In the same way, it gives them a solid foundation, English base for them to practice these skills, and keeps them engaged and motivated in the tasks that follow. As we can see at the end of the class, we have our writing activity where the students use all of the skills to do a writing. So we have within this lesson, we have the incorporation of visual, audio, and kinesthetic through writing. So we have this incorporation of all different learning styles. Next question. If we have IWB software, why do we need flashcards? So in many of our Express Publishing titles for primary, they include interactive whiteboard software, which can allow us to bring the book to life. It has many different interactive activities. It has different methods of presenting vocabulary through different videos or games. It also has the animated videos and audios that help us to achieve this. So why do we even need flashcards? Well, if we have a look at some of the options, A, B, and C, so we have some different options here. The correct option would be B, because through the flashcards allow us as teachers to add an extra element to our classroom, to incorporate different games and different activities to practice new words within our classroom. Something different to the IWB. It just gives us as teachers an extra resource, an extra element to implement within our classroom. And in our teachers' books, we quite often have within the teachers' books suggested activities for presenting vocabulary using flashcards. So we can see here we've got different flashcards for furniture or parts of the house, and our teachers' book gives us some suggestions for different games that we can play. So here it says pupils' books closed, put up the flashcards one at a time and say the corresponding words. The pupils repeat, point to each of them. The rest of the class will ask for verification and things like this. So this is how to present vocabulary. And at the bottom, we have an extension activity. We have something that can turn the flashcards into a game, something more interactive, something more engaging. Here it says, show a flashcard really quickly to the pupils, and the pupils try to guess which item it is. So it has a suggested activity to practice the vocabulary using the flashcards. So the teacher's book gives us teachers different ways, different methods to actually use these flashcards in different ways. Next question, why do I need models? So models are quite often important when we come to speaking or writing. At primary levels, if we, as teachers, we know that if we expect any kind of output from our students, we always need to give them some sufficient input first. We always need our students to know what is expected of them, and we also need them to have at their disposal some examples from which they can build their own speaking or writing tasks. So if we look at some of the answers, A, because I don't know what to ask my students to write or say. B, because the parents won't know what to do at home. This can be quite often true. How many times do you have students go home and they ask their parents to help them with the homework because they haven't understood what is expected of them? So that's why the answer would be C, because models are essentially a safety net for our students, so to produce material on their own. By having, before we have a speaking activity, by showing a conversation and analysing the conversation together, extracting useful language and presenting a model, we give students a template or a scaffold from which they can build their own materials. They can use these materials effectively to create their own conversations using the language that has been presented throughout the class, and it gives them this safety net, this support to be able to produce language on their own. And it's very important to remember this at primary levels especially. We need this input first before we expect our students to produce the language. So we can see here when we come to a writing activity in the interactive whiteboard software and in the pupils' books, we always have some form of a model. So here we're on a farm and we're talking to our friends and we're going to write about it. So we have some useful language at the bottom of the model. So and then we also have a template or a model that we can go through with our students that our students can later use to write their own letter. So this is why models are important at primary levels as a support, and also as as an example, so students can produce language on their own. Why do I need colouring and craft work activities? So many Express Publishing titles include quite often a colouring or craft work activities where students use their hands to make something. At primary levels, our young learners, as we know as teachers, they love to create things, they like using their hands, they're quite tactile learners. So why not incorporate this in our lessons? This is really the primary reason why we use them. So our answer would be C for this answer, for this question, because during these tasks, students can relax and give output through a stress-free environment. A colouring or a craft work activity at primary level is a form of production. So by creating something or doing a colouring activity, students are in a way practicing and producing target language or target vocabulary, whatever has been studied, in a stress-free environment in a way that is engaging and motivating for them. We can see here, for example, we have one exercise, so we have colour, point and say. So we can see on the surface it looks like a colouring activity. Students are colouring the different parts of furniture, but at the same time we can also use this activity to revise the different parts of different furniture. We have here the bed, the chair, TV, so students can revise key vocabulary. We can also see here we have colours and numbers. So students will be following the different numbers and different colours. So within one activity, students are revising furniture, they're revising numbers, and they're also revising colours through this colouring activity. So this can be something that can be used quite effectively with them. At the same time, a craft work activity, students build their own bedroom using plasticine, can be very engaging and motivating, and at the same time we're covering some of the key vocabulary in a meaningful way for them. For students, something meaningful is creating something. So why not use this to recap and revise specific vocabulary from the lesson. Next slide. Why do I need a CLIL section? CLIL, as I'm sure you're aware, so content and language integrated learning. This is studying English using subjects from across the curriculum. So for example, studying English through science or studying English through maths. So in our classrooms, of course we'll have students that perhaps are not very interested in English. So through CLIL, this can help us to find perhaps subjects that are more interesting to them. We may have students that are more interested in science or maths than English. So why not use these subjects as a way to study English at the same time? This is why we'd have for this question answer A. Students are more interested in different subjects, and it's a way for them to learn better, perhaps. We can see here some different examples. We have a CLIL lesson on maths, and we're counting the legs on different animals. So students are effectively, they're practicing numbers, but at the same time we have the English element, which is looking at the different vocabulary for animals, and then at the bottom of the page we have some addition activities. We're adding the legs together. So students here are effectively studying a maths lesson in English, which can be quite motivating for them. They can also see or be exposed to the idea that English can be useful outside of the classroom. English isn't something that can just be developed in a classroom. It has uses outside of the English classroom in maths, in science, in technology. And it's something that even at primary levels we can help establish. Okay, next question. Why do we have pair work or group work? So why do we have activities that involve pairs or groups? So first of all, let's have a look at some of the options, because it's fun to be able to gossip a little bit during the lesson. Hopefully this isn't the correct answer. We always try to avoid gossip in our classrooms. We want our students, of course, to be focused on the target language and what we've been teaching. B, because they give me the chance to sit down and relax a bit while the students are preparing them. Again, this is something that while our students are preparing these pair work or group work activities, this could be an opportunity for the teacher to walk around the class and monitor the students. So we probably discard this activity. C, because collaborative learning is part of the 21st century skills. This would be our answer. Through pair work and group work activities, students will be learning to collaborate with one another, learning to work together to be able to communicate effectively in pairs. This is one of our 21st century skills that are quite well sought after in today's world. Through collaboration, students also are exposed to the idea that when you learn a foreign language, it's not necessarily something that can be done individually. Learning a foreign language can be done in groups. You can learn from your peers and you can learn from your classmates at the same time. So here we have different communicative activities, talking with a friend or a game to help them. These can be valuable activities that can encourage collaboration and communication in the classroom. Next question, why do we have our world sections? So we talked before about CLIL and the advantages of having students study English through different subjects. Our world sections aim to expose students to different cultures, different ideas, different ways of thinking from around the world. It also allows students to learn about different cultures and learn about different ways of life outside of their own reality. So this is why the answer for this would be A. So cross-cultural information is important for 21st century learners. It enables the learners to make links between cultures in other countries and their own countries. And in this way they can help establish foster some key skills for 21st century learning. Here we can see some examples of cross-curricular activities. Our world, so we're looking here at different athletes from around the world. We've got Michael Phelps, Fernando Torres, and Natalia Osipova from Russia. From Russia. So students will be able to learn about athletes from different countries and perhaps connect these athletes with athletes from Russia. And at the same time recycle and practice and produce vocabulary that has been studied throughout the lessons. So our world sections help our students in this way to form these cross-cultural links and broaden their minds and keep them open-minded and establish this understanding. As English is used across the world in many different countries, so why not see how different people use English in different countries? Why do we have stickers in our books? Many of our activity books include sticker activities. As we talked about before, many of our primary learners are quite tactile learners. They enjoy touching things and creating things. So our answer for this one would be A. They're very good for kinesthetic learners. Students who like to learn by doing can use the stickers to help them revise perhaps key vocabulary in a relaxing, engaging way. We can see here, here we have a family tree. Students will have been studying vocabulary for families, and they use the stickers to revise the key vocabulary like grandmother, mum, dad, and everything like that at the same time. So it's a kind of like a connection between kinesthetic learning and revision of key vocabulary that has been studied throughout the lesson. Okay, so I think this is our final question. Why do we have literature in our course books? Many of our course books have a literature section where students can read about stories from around the world. So why do we bother to include these in our books? Perhaps because students don't have books at home. I think most students will have books at home, so this isn't really the main reason why. Because through reading for pleasure we teach students values, or because it is part of our curriculum. Now, literature could be a part of our curriculum, and it could be something that we wish to focus on. But I think our overall answer would be more related to B, because reading for pleasure is a way that we can teach students values. By introducing students to different stories, here we have a story from England, students first of all can read for pleasure. They can follow a new story, something that perhaps they haven't heard before. And within each story we have some kind of value. Here in this story we have the idea that being generous will reward you in the long term. So students are reading for pleasure, we have this idea of values, and at the same time we can always use the literature to focus on reading comprehension skills at the same time. So this is why literature is often an essential part of any lesson, even at primary levels, and it can be used in many different ways for our primary learners. So that was just some of the brief methodologies that we use in many of our primary materials. I hope you found some of the methodologies and some of the examples useful. We always aim to provide teachers with hopefully some ideas for you to take away to your own classes. And on behalf of Express Publishing, I'd like to thank you very much again for joining me here today for these webinars. I really do hope you found them useful, and I hope to see you again at future seminars. If you have any questions, or if you have any comments, please let us know. And if you want to have any further information on how to purchase any of our course books, or in general, please visit us at www.expresspublishing.co.uk. You can also follow us on social media via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or YouTube. There you can find a range of different materials, teaching resources, and academic talks, and also interviews with other teachers to help expand and explore new methodologies and new ideas that can help you in your ELT classrooms. So thank you very much once again, and I'll say bye for now.